The golden hues of the late afternoon sun bathed the city park in a soft, tranquil glow. Elena Rivers, a 32-year-old graphic designer, strolled leisurely along the familiar winding paths with Rocky, her loyal border collie. It was their daily ritual, a moment to unwind, forget the pressures of work, and bask in the companionship they shared. Rocky trotted alongside her, his tail wagging like a metronome of happiness. His sleek black and white coat gleamed, and his bright eyes sparkled with curiosity as he paused to sniff every cluster of wildflowers they passed. Elena smiled down at him, the leash slack in her hand. The scent of freshly cut grass mingled with the distant laughter of children playing on the swings. "Come on, Rocky," Elena said gently, giving his leash a playful tug. "You've sniffed enough flowers for one day. Let's finish the loop before dinner." Rocky barked softly in agreement, his ears perking up as he turned to her. She chuckled, shaking her head. "You're too smart for your own good. You know that?" They continued down the path, Elena's mind drifting as she soaked in the peace of the moment. The park was one of the few places she felt completely at ease. Work deadlines, client emails, and the constant hum of city life all faded away here. It was just her and Rocky, the way she liked it. But as they rounded a bend, Elena's contentment faltered. Ahead, a man loitered near a bench, his posture slouched and his hood pulled low over his face. Something about him set her on edge. His stained hoodie and scuffed boots didn't bother her, but the way he stared, sharp, calculating, sent a ripple of unease through her. Elena tightened her grip on Rocky's leash. Her instincts told her to turn back, but the path behind her was empty, and she didn't want to seem paranoid. Instead, she pressed forward, keeping her gaze straight ahead and her steps measured. As they neared the man, his gaze locked on hers, and a sneer spread across his face. "Out for a stroll, huh?" he muttered, his tone dripping with disdain. His eyes flicked down to Rocky. "Fancy dog for someone like you." Elena hesitated, her stomach knotting, but she kept her voice calm. "Just getting some fresh air," she replied, trying to move past him. The man scoffed, his glare lingering on her. "Fresh air? Yeah, walk your fancy dog like nothing happened." His voice rose slightly, a bitter edge cutting through the peaceful park ambiance. Elena frowned, confusion mingling with her unease. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her steps slowing involuntarily. "You people," he snapped, his voice rising, "coming into places you don't belong. Raising rents, pushing us out. Last month, I lost my apartment because of people like you. And now you're here, walking through my park like it's yours." Elena stopped, her grip tightening on Rocky's leash. Her heart pounded, but she refused to let it show. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said firmly, "but I don't have anything to do with that. Don't play dumb." The man snarled, stepping closer, his posture shifted, his body language becoming more menacing. "You think you can just take over and nothing happens? Think you're better than me?" Rocky growled softly, his ears flattening as he pressed closer to Elena. She instinctively stepped back, her free hand gripping the leash as her pulse quickened. "Look," Elena said, her voice steady despite the fear creeping into her chest. "I don't want any trouble. I'm just walking my dog." The man laughed bitterly. "Trouble? You brought the trouble. People like you think you can take everything, jobs, housing, respect, and leave nothing for the rest of us. I'm tired of losing." Elena's mind raced. Her logical side urged her to de-escalate, but every instinct screamed to run. "I'm sorry for whatever you're going through," she said carefully, "but I had nothing to do with it." The man's gaze dropped to Rocky, his sneer turning darker. "That mutt looks like he thinks he's tough. Just like his owner." Elena's breath caught as his words turned more pointed. "Let's go, Rocky," she said, tugging the leash as she tried to move past him. But he stepped into their path, blocking them. "You think you can just walk away?" he hissed, his voice dripping with malice. "Maybe it's time someone reminded you who this park belongs to." Rocky growled louder, his body tense as he stood protectively in front of Elena. She took a shaky step back, her heart pounding in her ears. The man smirked, his eyes narrowing as he took a step closer. Before Elena could react, he lunged. Elena's breath caught as the man surged forward, his hand outstretched toward Rocky's leash. Instinctively, she stepped back, putting herself between him and her dog. Her free hand shot out, shoving at his chest with a burst of adrenaline-fueled strength. "Back off," she shouted, her voice shaking but loud enough to echo through the otherwise quiet park. Rocky barked sharply, his teeth bared as he lunged forward against the leash. The sound startled the man, but only for a moment. His sneer deepened, his eyes glinting with anger. "You've got guts. I'll give you that," he spat, brushing his hoodie where Elena's hand had pushed him. "But guts don't mean much when there's no one around to back you up." Elena's heart raced as she scanned the path behind her. The park, so full of life moments ago, now felt eerily deserted. A jogger passed in the distance, too far to notice the confrontation. The children's laughter had faded, leaving only the rustle of leaves in the breeze. "Leave us alone," Elena demanded, her voice firmer now, though her hands trembled around the leash. Rocky growled again, his stance protective as his tail stiffened. The man laughed, a cruel sound that sent a shiver down her spine. "What's the plan, lady? You gonna sick this mud on me?" His eyes flicked to Rocky, and he tilted his head. "Or maybe I take him instead. Sell him to someone who can actually feed him." The venom in his words ignited something in Elena. Her fear gave way to anger, her grip on Rocky's leash tightening as she squared her shoulders. "Don't you dare touch him." The man stepped closer, his voice lowering to a menacing growl. "What are you gonna do about it? You think you're better than me? Let's see how tough you are when you're on the ground." Rocky barked again, louder this time, the sound echoing through the park. His muscles tensed as he strained against the leash, ready to protect Elena at any cost. For a fleeting moment, the man hesitated, his gaze darting to the dog. "Stay back," Elena shouted, pulling Rocky's leash tighter. Her voice was stronger now, fueled by the primal instinct to protect the dog who had been her unwavering companion through everything. But the man didn't listen. He lunged again, his hand reaching for Rocky. This time, Rocky reacted before Elena could stop him. With a ferocious snarl, the dog lunged forward, his teeth snapping at the man's outstretched arm. The man yelped, stumbling back as he clutched his sleeve, his face twisted in fury. "You little," he cut himself off, his voice rising in rage as he lifted a boot and kicked at Rocky. The blow landed hard against the dog's side, sending him sprawling onto the ground with a sharp yelp. "Rocky!" Elena screamed, dropping to her knees beside him. Her hands trembled as she cradled his trembling body, her heart breaking at the sight of his pained eyes. Tears blurred her vision, but anger burned hotter than ever. "You monster," she spat, her voice shaking with fury as she stood. "How dare you!" But the man didn't wait for her to finish. Seeing her focus on Rocky, he turned and bolted down the path, his footsteps pounding against the pavement as he disappeared into the trees. Elena's breath came in shallow gasps as she stared after him, torn between chasing him and staying with Rocky. The dog whimpered softly, his tail wagging faintly as if to reassure her. "It's okay, boy," she whispered, her voice trembling as she ran her hands over his fur. "Checking for injuries. You're going to be okay. I won't let anything happen to you." Rocky whined, his nose nudging against her hand as if to tell her he'd be all right. But the bruises forming along his ribs told a different story. Elena fumbled for her phone, her hands shaking as she dialed 911. The operator's calm voice was a lifeline in the chaos. "This is 911. What's your emergency?" "A man attacked us," Elena stammered, the words tumbling out in a frantic rush. "He hurt my dog. He's running through the park, please. You have to send someone." The operator's voice remained steady. "Are you in a safe location, ma'am?" Elena glanced around, her free hand resting protectively on Rocky. "Yes, I'm on the main path near the south entrance. Please hurry. Officers are on their way." "Can you describe the man for me?" Elena closed her eyes, forcing herself to remember every detail despite the adrenaline coursing through her. White male, mid-20s, brown hair, wearing a stained hoodie and scuffed boots. He seemed angry, like he was looking for trouble. "Thank you. Stay where you are and keep your dog calm. Help is on the way." Elena ended the call, her hands still trembling as she stroked Rocky's fur. "You're so brave," she whispered, her voice breaking. "We're going to get through this. I promise." Rocky's tail wagged weakly, and Elena felt a flicker of hope. But as the faint sound of approaching sirens reached her ears, she knew one thing for certain: this wasn't over. Not yet. The wail of sirens grew louder as Elena remained crouched beside Rocky, her hand never leaving his side. Her breath hitched with each shallow rise and fall of his chest. her anger and fear simmering just below the surface. The park, once a place of peace, now felt oppressive and alien. "It's okay, Rocky," she murmured, more for herself than for him. "Help is coming. We're going to get you taken care of." Blue and red lights illuminated the path as two patrol cars rolled to a stop at the park's south entrance. Moments later, two officers approached, their movements brisk but measured. Elena stood, her legs shaky but firm. As they closed the distance, "Are you the one who called?" one of the officers asked. A tall man with sharp eyes and a steady voice. "Yes," Elena said, her voice quivering despite her attempt to stay calm. "That man, he attacked us. He hurt my dog." The officer's gaze shifted to Rocky, who lay on the ground, his ears twitching at the sound of the newcomers. "Is your dog injured?" Elena nodded, her throat tightening. "He kicked him hard, twice. He's hurt, I think his ribs." The second officer, a woman with a kind but focused expression, crouched beside Rocky, her hands moving carefully over his side. "He's conscious, which is a good sign. We'll call animal services to check him out." Elena's heart ached at the sight of Rocky lying so still. She reached down, stroking his head softly as the officer spoke into her radio, requesting immediate veterinary assistance. "Can you tell us what happened?" the male officer asked. Pulling out a notepad, Elena straightened, inhaling deeply as she fought to steady her voice. "I was walking Rocky, just like I do every day. That man, he was waiting on a bench. He started saying things, accusing me of things I don't even understand. When I tried to walk away, he blocked my path and threatened me. Rocky barked, trying to protect me, and that's when her voice broke, but she pressed on. That's when he kicked him." The officer nodded, his pen moving swiftly over the notepad. "Can you describe the man?" Elena repeated the description she'd given to the 911 operator. "White male. Mid-20s, brown hair, stained hoodie, and scuffed boots." The officer's jaw tightened as he jotted down the details. "Did he take anything from you?" he asked. Elena shook her head. "No, but he threatened to. He said he'd hurt Rocky if I didn't give him something." "Did you recognize him? Has he approached you before?" "No," Elena said firmly. "I've never seen him before today." The female officer rose, nodding to her partner. "Animal services is en route. They'll take care of the dog." The male officer turned back to Elena. "We'll search the area for the suspect. Based on your description, we may be able to track him down quickly. Do you want to come to the station to give a full statement?" Elena hesitated, her eyes darting back to Rocky. "I need to stay with him," she said softly. "I can give a statement later." The officer nodded. "Of course, we'll follow up with you. For now, stay with your dog. You've already done the right thing by calling us." Elena dropped to her knees beside Rocky again as the officers moved away, their voices fading as they discussed their next steps. The adrenaline that had fueled her earlier was beginning to wane, leaving her drained and trembling. She leaned down, pressing her forehead to Rocky's. "You're going to be okay," she whispered. "We're going to get through this." Rocky's tail gave a faint wag, and Elena's chest tightened. Despite everything, he was still trying to comfort her. A few minutes later, a van marked "Animal Services" pulled up, and a vet tech climbed out, carrying a stretcher. She approached with a warm but professional demeanor, crouching beside Rocky to assess him. "Hi there, buddy," the tech said gently, running her hands along Rocky's side. "You're a tough one, aren't you?" "He is," Elena said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's the strongest dog I know." The tech smiled reassuringly. "We'll take good care of him. I promise. Looks like he's in some pain, but we'll do a full checkup and make sure nothing's broken." With practiced ease, the tech and her assistant lifted Rocky onto the stretcher. He whimpered softly but didn't struggle, his trust in Elena unwavering. Elena followed them to the van, her hand resting on Rocky's head the entire time. "Which hospital are you taking him to?" she asked, her voice firm despite the tears threatening to spill. "City Animal Hospital," the tech replied. "They've got great emergency care. You can follow us there." Elena nodded, watching as they secured Rocky inside the van. As the doors closed, she turned to her car, determination hardening her resolve. This wasn't over, not until the man who did this was brought to justice. Elena's hands trembled on the steering wheel as she followed the Animal Services van through the dimly lit streets of the city. Her mind raced, replaying the confrontation over and over. Each time, her anger swelled. The man's sneer, his words, the sound of his boot hitting Rocky's side. It was all too much. Rocky, she thought, glancing at the empty passenger seat. Her heart ached at the thought of him lying alone in the van. He'd been her rock through so many of life's challenges. And now he was the one who needed saving. The bright lights of the city animal hospital came into view, snapping Elena out of her thoughts. She parked hurriedly and rushed toward the van as the vet tech and her assistant unloaded Rocky on the stretcher. He looked up at her with tired eyes, his tail wagging faintly. "You're such a good boy," she whispered, brushing a hand over his head. "We're going to get you all fixed up." The tech gave her a reassuring nod. "We'll take him straight to the exam room. You can come with us." Elena followed closely as they wheeled Rocky inside. The hospital was quiet except for the soft murmur of voices and the occasional bark from another room. The sterile smell of antiseptic filled the air. They entered a brightly lit exam room, and a vet in a crisp white coat stepped in moments later. "Hi, I'm Dr. Patel," the vet said warmly. Her eyes were kind but focused as she assessed Rocky. "We'll do everything we can to make sure he's okay." Elena nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "Thank you." Dr. Patel crouched beside Rocky, her hands moving gently over his side. He whimpered slightly but didn't resist. "He's got some bruising here," she said, her tone clinical but calm. "It's tender, but I don't feel any fractures. We'll need an X-ray to confirm." Elena nodded again, unable to speak. She kept her hand on Rocky's paw, her touch light but constant, as though she could will him to heal through sheer determination. "You can wait in the lounge while we run the tests," Dr. Patel said, standing and offering Elena a small smile. "We'll let you know as soon as we have results." "I'll stay here," Elena said quickly, her voice firm. "I want to be with him." Dr. Patel hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "All right, just try to keep him calm." The vet and her team worked efficiently, moving Rocky to the imaging equipment while Elena stood to the side, her arms wrapped around herself. The minutes felt like hours as she watched them handle her dog with care. Finally, Dr. Patel returned with the X-rays in hand. She placed them on a light box and pointed to the images. "Good news, no fractures," she said, her voice warm with relief. "He has some deep bruising, but nothing that won't heal with rest and care." Elena let out a shaky breath, her knees nearly giving way beneath her. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Thank you so much. We'll give him some pain medication and keep him overnight for observation." Dr. Patel continued, "But I'm optimistic he'll make a full recovery." Elena nodded, wiping at the tears that streamed down her face. "He's the strongest dog I know." As the staff prepared Rocky's bed in the recovery area, Elena sat beside him, stroking his fur and whispering words of comfort. He looked up at her with tired but trusting eyes, his tail wagging faintly with every soothing word. "You're my hero, Rocky," she said softly. "We're going to get through this together." The next morning, Elena woke in a stiff chair beside Rocky's bed. The hospital staff had allowed her to stay overnight, understanding her refusal to leave his side. Rocky was resting peacefully, his breathing even, and the sight brought a wave of relief. But as she sat there, watching him, her thoughts turned to the man who had done this. The police were searching for him. But would that be enough? What if he disappeared? What if justice wasn't served? Her phone buzzed on the small table beside her. She picked it up, her heart sinking as she saw James Carpenter's name on the screen. James was an old friend, someone she hadn't spoken to in months. But his background as a former military operative had always made him her first call in times of crisis. She swiped to answer. "James?" "Elena." His voice was deep and steady, the sound immediately grounding her. "I got your message. What happened?" Her throat tightened as she recounted the attack, her words tumbling out in a rush. She described the man's sneer, his threats, the brutal way he'd kicked Rocky. There was a long pause on the other end of the line before James spoke again. "You called the police?" "Yes, they're looking for him." "But," Elena hesitated, "but what if they don't find him? What if he hurt someone else?" James's voice hardened. "They'll find him, and if they don't," he trailed off, the weight of his words lingering. Elena took a shaky breath. "I need to make sure he's caught. James, I can't let him get away with this." There was a beat of silence before James replied. "All right, I'll help, but you have to be sure about this. Elena, once we start, we don't stop." Elena's grip on the phone tightened as she looked down at Rocky. His tail twitching in his sleep. Her anger and resolve crystallized in that moment. "I'm sure," she said. The mid-morning sun filtered through the hospital's wide glass windows as Elena stood by the reception desk. Clutching Rocky's leash in her hand, her heart felt lighter knowing he was safe and on the mend. But her mind churned with restless energy. The man who attacked them was still out there, and the thought made her fists clench. James arrived just as she was finishing the discharge papers. His tall, broad frame filled the doorway, and his sharp eyes scanned the room before landing on her. Dressed in a leather jacket and dark jeans, he carried an air of quiet authority that immediately put her at ease. "Elena," he said, his voice calm but firm. He nodded toward Rocky, who wagged his tail weakly. "How's he doing?" "He's okay," Elena replied, her hand brushing over Rocky's head. "He's bruised but strong. They said he'll heal with time." James crouched down, giving Rocky a gentle scratch behind the ears. "Good boy," he murmured, straightening. He turned to Elena, his expression serious. "Now tell me about this guy. Everything you remember." Elena recounted the events again, her words steady but laced with anger. She described the man's sneering tone, his bitter accusations, and the malicious way he'd hurt Rocky. James listened intently, his jaw tightening with every detail. "Sounds like someone with a chip on his shoulder," James said, crossing his arms. "People like that usually stick to familiar places. He probably isn't far." Elena nodded, her resolve hardening. "What do we do?" James tilted his head, considering. "The police have their process. But we can speed things up. I'll make a few calls. See if anyone recognizes the description. Meanwhile, you stay with Rocky. Keep him safe." Elena hesitated. "I want to help. I can't just sit here and wait." James studied her for a moment, then nodded. "All right, but we do this smart. No taking risks. We start by checking the places someone like him might go, cheap bars, abandoned buildings, anywhere he can hide." Elena tightened her grip on Rocky's leash. "Let's find him." By the time they left the animal hospital, the sun was high in the sky. James drove with quiet precision, his focus on the road as he spoke to someone on the phone. "I need a favor," he said, his voice low. "Looking for someone, mid-20s, brown hair, hoodie, scuffed boots. Might have been seen around South End Park." "Yeah, call me when you have anything." Elena sat in the passenger seat, Rocky resting his head on her lap. She stroked his fur absently, her mind racing. "Do you really think we'll find him?" she asked. "We will," James replied confidently. "People like him think they're invisible, but they always leave a trail." Their first stop was a dingy bar on the edge of the South End, its flickering neon sign barely clinging to life. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of stale beer and cigarette smoke. James approached the bartender, sliding a $20 bill across the counter. "Looking for someone," he said, his tone even. "Brown hair, hoodie, hangs around the park. Name might be Jared." The bartender eyed the bill, then pocketed it with a shrug. "Yeah, saw someone like that a couple nights ago. Loudmouth, kept talking about how the world's against him." "Where'd he go?" James asked, leaning in slightly. The bartender hesitated, then nodded toward the back door. "Said he was crashing at a buddy's place. Mike, I think. Lives over in the industrial district." James gave a curt nod. "Thanks." As they left the bar, Elena glanced at him, her heart pounding. "We're getting closer." James's lips curved into a faint, humorless smile. "We are, but we're not rushing in blind. We'll check the district, but stay sharp. He's dangerous, and people like him don't go down easy." The industrial district loomed ahead, a sprawling maze of crumbling warehouses and graffiti-covered walls. The air was heavy with the smell of oil and rust, and the faint hum of machinery echoed in the distance. James parked the car a few blocks away, his sharp eyes scanning the area. "We go in quiet," he said. "Stick close to me, and if anything feels wrong, we pull back." Elena nodded, her grip on Rocky's leash tightening. "Got it." They moved through the district with purpose, their footsteps silent on the cracked pavement. James's military training was evident in the way he scanned their surroundings, his body language calm but alert. It didn't take long to find the place. A light flickered in one of the warehouse windows, and faint voices carried on the wind. James held up a hand, signaling Elena to stop. Stay here, he whispered. I'll check it out. No, Elena said firmly, stepping closer. I'm coming with you. James hesitated, then nodded. Fine, but stay behind me. They approached the warehouse cautiously, slipping through the shadows until they reached a broken window. Inside, they could see a man slouched on a makeshift bed, a hoodie pulled over his head. A half-empty bottle of beer sat on the ground beside him. That's him, Elena whispered, her voice trembling with anger. That's the man. James's jaw tightened. Stay here. Before she could argue, he slipped through the window and landed silently inside. His movements were precise as he crept toward the man, but as he closed the distance, a floorboard creaked, and the man's head snapped up. What the? He started, scrambling to his feet. James was on him in an instant, pinning him to the ground with practiced ease. Jared Owens? He said coldly. You're coming with us. Jared struggled, his face twisting in anger. Who the hell are you? He spat. You can't do this. James tightened his grip, his voice like ice. You attacked a woman and her dog. You're done. Elena climbed through the window, her chest heaving with adrenaline as she faced Jared. Her hands shook, but her voice was steady. You thought you could hurt us and walk away, she said. You were wrong. Elena's heart raced as she stood over Jared, her hands trembling with a mixture of anger and adrenaline. The man who had attacked her and Rocky was finally within reach. His arrogant sneer replaced by panic as James kept him pinned to the ground. You, Jared spat, his voice dripping with venom as he glared up at her. You're crazy. You know that? Bringing some muscle just to scare me? Elena clenched her fists, her breath coming in short bursts as she fought to keep her composure. You hurt my dog, she said, her voice low but fierce. You threatened me. Do you have any idea what you've done? Jared smirked, though the fear in his eyes betrayed his bravado. It was just a mutt. He muttered. What's the big deal? The words ignited something in Elena. She stepped closer, her fists tightening until her nails bit into her palms. James glanced at her sharply, his calm voice cutting through the tension. Elena, don't. He's not worth it. But she couldn't hold back any longer. Not worth it? She snapped, her voice trembling with emotion. You think you can just walk away after what you did? You think there are no consequences? Jared laughed bitterly, shaking his head. You're all the same, acting like you're better than me. Well, newsflash, lady. The world doesn't care about your fancy dog or your sob story. James shifted his weight, his grip on Jared firm but controlled. You should have thought about that before you picked a fight with the wrong person, he said coldly. Now shut up before you make this worse. Elena took a deep breath, forcing herself to step back. Her anger was a roaring fire, but she knew she couldn't let it consume her. The police are on their way, she said, her voice steadier now. You're going to answer for everything you've done. At that moment, the faint sound of sirens pierced the air, growing louder with each passing second. Jared's smirk faltered, his eyes darting toward the window as though planning an escape. You can't run, James said, his tone icy. And even if you tried, you wouldn't get far. Seconds later, flashing blue and red lights illuminated the warehouse. The sirens blared as two patrol cars screeched to a stop outside, their doors swinging open as officers poured out, weapons drawn. This is the police, one of them shouted, his voice booming. Everyone stay where you are. James raised his hands slowly, nodding toward the officers as they entered the warehouse. It's him, he said, gesturing to Jared. This is the guy. Two officers approached, their movements brisk and efficient. They hauled Jared to his feet, snapping handcuffs around his wrists as he cursed under his breath. This is a mistake, Jared shouted, struggling against their grip. I didn't do anything. She's lying. The officer holding him didn't even flinch. You'll have a chance to explain yourself at the station, he said flatly. For now, keep quiet. As Jared was led outside, his shouts faded into the night. Elena stood frozen, her chest heaving as the weight of the confrontation began to lift. James placed a steady hand on her shoulder, his voice calm. It's over. But Elena shook her head, her gaze fixed on the empty space where Jared had been moments before. Not yet, she said quietly. He's in custody, but it's not over. I need to make sure he faces justice. James nodded, his expression unreadable. Then we'll see it through. By the time Elena and James arrived at the police station, exhaustion was setting in. The adrenaline that had fueled her earlier was fading. replaced by a dull ache in her chest. She sat in a small, sterile room, clutching Rocky's leash as an officer entered with a notepad. "Miss Rivers," he said, offering a polite nod, "we need your statement to proceed with the charges. Are you ready?" Elena straightened, her grip on the leash tightening. "I'm ready." The officer sat across from her, his pen poised. "Start from the beginning. Tell me everything that happened." Elena recounted the events with painstaking detail. She described the peaceful walk in the park, Jared's taunts, and the way he had blocked her path. Her voice wavered when she spoke about Rocky's bravery and the brutal kicks that had left him crumpled on the ground. "Rocky was just protecting me," she said, her eyes glistening with tears. "And he hurt him for it. He didn't stop until Rocky couldn't get up." The officer nodded, his expression grim. "You're doing great, Miss Rivers. Take your time." Elena took a shaky breath, continuing to describe the hours that followed, the call to James, the search for Jared, and the confrontation in the warehouse. She spared no detail, her determination unwavering. When she finished, the officer set down his pen, meeting her gaze. "We have enough to charge him with assault, theft, and animal cruelty. Based on your testimony and the evidence, this is a strong case." Elena exhaled slowly, relief washing over her. "Thank you." He gave her a small, reassuring smile. "Thank you for coming forward. We'll be in touch with updates as the case moves forward." As the officer left the room, James stepped inside, his presence steady and grounding. "How'd it go?" he asked. "They're charging him," Elena said, her voice firm. "It's a strong case." James nodded. "Good. Now we make sure it sticks." Elena met his gaze, her resolve hardening. "I'm not going to let him get away with this. Not after what he did." James smiled faintly, the hint of admiration in his eyes. "I didn't think you would." The days that followed were a whirlwind of preparation. Elena barely had time to process her emotions as she balanced caring for Rocky and meeting with the prosecution team. Every moment felt like a step toward ensuring justice. But the weight of it all was unrelenting. Ellen Moore, the assistant district attorney assigned to the case, was a no-nonsense woman with sharp eyes and a commanding presence. She met Elena in a quiet office at the district courthouse, a stack of files already spread across the table when Elena arrived. "Elena, it's good to meet you," Ellen said, gesturing to a chair. "We've got a solid case here, but I want to make sure we're prepared for every angle the defense might take." Elena sat, smoothing Rocky's leash in her hands as she nodded. "Whatever it takes." Ellen gave her a small, approving smile. "Good. Let's start with the timeline. Walk me through the day of the incident again." Elena recounted the events for what felt like the 100th time, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. Ellen listened intently, occasionally jotting down notes or asking clarifying questions. When Elena finished, Ellen leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "The defense will try to spin this as a misunderstanding," she said. "They'll argue that Jared felt threatened by Rocky and acted out of fear. It's nonsense, but it's the kind of narrative that can sway a jury if we're not careful." Elena's grip on the leash tightened. "He wasn't afraid. He was angry. He wanted to hurt Rocky, to hurt me." Ellen nodded. "And we'll make that clear. Your testimony is going to be crucial. We'll also rely on the veterinary records and the office's accounts from the arrest. Jared's criminal history, while minor, establishes a pattern of aggression. We'll use that to show his actions weren't a one-time lapse in judgment." Elena's heart pounded at the thought of facing Jared in court, but she forced herself to focus. "What about what he said?" she asked. "About me not belonging there? Will that matter?" "It does," Ellen said firmly. "It speaks to his motive and intent. But we'll need to frame it carefully to keep the jury focused on the facts." As the meeting continued, Ellen outlined the structure of the trial, from opening statements to cross-examinations. She explained the role Elena would play as a witness, walking her through potential questions and strategies. James joined them midway through the session, his calm presence a steadying force for Elena. He asked pointed questions, ensuring they covered every detail. When the meeting ended, Ellen gave Elena an encouraging smile. "You're doing great. This isn't easy, but you're handling it with strength. Keep that up, and we'll make sure justice is served." The courtroom was a stark and imposing space, its polished wood benches and high ceilings designed to instill a sense of order. Elena sat at the prosecution's table, her hands clasped tightly around Rocky's leash. James was seated behind her in the gallery, his steady gaze a quiet reassurance. Jared sat at the defense table, his posture rigid and his face unreadable. His lawyer, a wiry man named Victor Finch, exuded practiced confidence as he adjusted his tie and glanced toward the jury. Ellen rose to deliver her opening statement, her voice clear and commanding. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about accountability. Jared Owens deliberately targeted Elena Rivers and her dog, Rocky, with malicious intent. The evidence will show that his actions were not the result of fear or misunderstanding but a calculated attempt to harm and intimidate. As Ellen outlined the case, Elena watched the jury's faces, searching for signs of empathy or understanding. Some jurors nodded slightly, while others remained impassive, their focus shifting between Ellen and Jared. When it was Finch's turn to speak, his tone was smooth and conversational. This case isn't as clear-cut as the prosecution would have you believe. He began, gesturing toward Jared. My client has been portrayed as a monster. But the truth is far more complex. He acted out of fear, not malice. This was an unfortunate misunderstanding, not a crime. Elena's jaw tightened as she listened, anger simmering beneath the surface. Finch's words were carefully crafted to paint Jared as a victim. But she knew the truth, and she was determined to make the jury see it too. When Elena was called to testify, her heart pounded as she approached the witness stand. She took the oath, her hands trembling slightly as she raised them. Sitting down, she glanced at Ellen, who gave her a small nod of encouragement. Elena, Ellen began, her tone warm but professional. Can you tell the court what happened on the day of the incident? Elena recounted the events once again, her voice steady despite the emotions swirling inside her. She described the peaceful walk, Jared's taunts, and the way he had blocked her path. Her voice faltered when she spoke of Rocky's bravery and the brutal attack. But she pressed on, her resolve unwavering. Why didn't you walk away? Ellen asked gently. I tried, Elena said firmly, but he wouldn't let me. He was angry, and he wanted to scare me. When Rocky tried to protect me, Jared took his anger out on him. Ellen nodded. How has this affected you and Rocky since that day? Elena took a deep breath. Rocky is healing, but it's been hard. He's always been my protector, my best friend. Seeing him hurt like that, I can't put it into words. I just want to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. As Ellen returned to her seat, Finch rose, adjusting his tie as he approached the stand. His questions were sharp and calculated, designed to cast doubt on Elena's account. You seem very emotional about this incident, he said smoothly. Isn't it possible that you misinterpreted my client's actions? Elena's jaw tightened. No, he made his intentions very clear. Finch smirked. You claim he threatened you. But did he ever physically harm you? No, Elena admitted, her voice steady. But he hurt Rocky. That was enough. Finch pressed further, but Elena held her ground, her resolve unshaken. By the time she stepped down from the stand, she felt a surge of pride. She had spoken her. The courtroom buzzed with tension as the defense called their witnesses. Elena sat stiffly at the prosecution's table, her hands resting on Rocky's leash as she listened to the carefully constructed testimonies designed to paint Jared Owens as misunderstood rather than malicious. Victor Finch, Jared's lawyer, exuded confidence as he led a former co-worker of Jared's to the stand. The man, a wiry figure with a nervous demeanor, fidgeted as he adjusted his glasses. Finch's tone was smooth and reassuring. Mr. Caldwell, Finch began, you've known my client for several years, correct? Yes, the man replied, his voice shaky. We worked together at the shipping warehouse. Would you describe Jared as an aggressive person? Caldwell hesitated, glancing toward Jared, who sat stiffly at the defense table. Not usually. He can get frustrated. But it's because of the things he's been through. Losing his job, his apartment, it's been hard on him. Finch nodded sympathetically. So, in your opinion, his actions on the day in question could have been influenced by stress rather than any malicious intent? I guess so, Caldwell said reluctantly. He's not a bad guy. Just struggling. Finch smiled. Thank you. No further questions. Ellen rose for her cross-examination, her sharp gaze fixed on Caldwell. Mr. Caldwell, you mentioned that Jared can get frustrated. Have you ever witnessed this frustration escalate to physical aggression? Caldwell shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Well, there were a couple of times. At work, he got into arguments. One time, it got physical. And did this behavior cause any concern among your coworkers? Ellen pressed. Yeah, Caldwell admitted. People tried to avoid setting him off. Ellen nodded. Thank you for your honesty. She returned to her seat. Her expression calm. The defense's attempts to soften Jared's image were steadily unraveling. When Jared was called to testify, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. All eyes turned to him as he approached the stand. His movements stiff and deliberate. He raised his hand to take the oath, his expression carefully neutral. Finch began his questioning with a calculated softness. Jared, can you tell us what happened in the park that day? Jared leaned into the microphone. His voice measured. I was just walking through the park, minding my business, when that lady and her dog came out of nowhere. The dog started barking and growling at me. I panicked. I didn't mean to hurt the dog, but I felt threatened. Finch nodded. And did you intentionally kick the dog, as the prosecution claims? No, Jared said firmly. It was instinct. I was scared. Finch smiled, his tone sympathetic. Thank you, Jared. No further questions. Ellen stood, her steps deliberate as she approached the stand. Jared, she began, her voice steady. You claim you felt threatened by Rocky. Did you report this supposed aggression to anyone? Animal control? The police? Jared hesitated, shifting in his seat. No, but. Ellen cut him off. And you said you didn't mean to hurt the dog. Then why did witnesses hear you shouting threats at Miss Rivers? Why did officers find her wallet in your possession? Jared's face reddened. She probably planted it. He snapped. This whole thing is a setup. The courtroom murmured, and the judge rapped his gavel for order. Ellen's voice remained calm but firm. So, according to you, Miss Rivers is lying. Her dog is aggressive, and the evidence against you is fabricated. Is that your defense? Jared glared at her but said nothing. Ellen turned to the jury. Her expression measured. No further questions. The final day of the trial arrived, and the courtroom was thick with anticipation. The gallery was packed with spectators, their whispers fading as the judge called the court to order. Ellen rose first, her voice clear and resolute. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about accountability. Jared Owens made a series of deliberate choices that led to the events in question. He approached Miss Rivers and her dog with hostility. He threatened her, harmed her dog, and stole from her. These actions were not the result of fear or misunderstanding. They were calculated and cruel. She gestured toward Elena, seated at the prosecution's table. Miss Rivers has shown remarkable courage in standing up to Jared Owens. Her testimony, the veterinary records, and the police report all paint a clear picture of his intent. We ask you to hold him accountable for his actions. Victor Finch stood next, adjusting his tie as he addressed the jury. My client is not a perfect man, but he is not the monster the prosecution would have you believe. He acted out of fear, not malice, and this situation has been blown out of proportion. I urge you to consider the possibility of reasonable doubt and to make a decision based on the facts, not emotion. Elena watched the jury closely, her heart pounding as they listened intently to both sides. When the arguments concluded, the judge dismissed the jury to deliberate. The hours stretched into an agonizing wait. Elena sat in the courthouse lounge, James beside her, his steady presence the only thing keeping her grounded. She clutched Rocky's leash tightly, her thoughts spiraling as she replayed the trial in her mind. Finally, the bailiff appeared, his expression unreadable. The jury has reached a verdict. Elena's stomach churned as she followed James back into the courtroom. The jury filed in, their faces stoic as they took their seats. The judge called for silence, his tone grave. Has the jury reached a verdict? A middle-aged woman stood, holding a folded piece of paper. We have, Your Honor. The judge nodded. Please read the verdict. The woman unfolded the paper, her voice steady as she spoke. In the case of Jared Owens, we find the defendant guilty on all counts: assault, theft, and animal cruelty. Relief washed over Elena like a wave. Her hands trembled as she gripped the leash tighter, tears springing to her eyes. Jared's face twisted in anger as he rose from his seat. This is bull, he shouted, his voice echoing in the courtroom. You're all against me. The judge rapped his gavel sharply. Mr. Owens, sit down or you will be removed. Jared slumped back into his chair, muttering under his breath, The judge turned his attention to the sentencing. For your crimes, Mr. Owens, you are sentenced to 5 years in prison for assault and theft, with an additional 3 years for animal cruelty, to be served consecutively. You will also pay restitution for Miss Rivers' veterinary expenses. As Jared was led away in handcuffs, Elena exhaled deeply, the tension in her chest finally releasing. James placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. You did it, he said quietly. It's over. Elena nodded, her voice soft but firm. For Rocky, the courthouse steps felt impossibly long as Elena descended them. Her body weighed down with exhaustion and relief. The trial was over, and Jared was behind bars. Yet, as she stepped into the bright afternoon sun, a strange emptiness lingered. She had fought for justice and won. But the scars, both hers and Rocky's, remained. James walked beside her, silent but steady. The hum of reporters and bystanders filled the air. But Elena blocked it all out. She wasn't ready to speak about the trial yet. She wanted to go home, to sit with Rocky in the quiet and remind herself that they were safe now. You did good in there, James said, breaking the silence. His tone was calm but carried an edge of admiration. Not everyone could have faced what you did. Elena managed a small smile, though her voice was heavy. I just kept thinking about Rocky. About how much he's been through because of Jared. I couldn't let him get away with it. James nodded, his eyes scanning the street as they approached her car. Well, you made sure he won't. 8 years is a long time. He's not hurting anyone else. As they reached the car, Elena paused, her gaze drifting to the passenger seat where Rocky's bed lay. I couldn't have done it without you, she said, her voice soft. Thank you, James, for everything. He gave her a rare smile. Anytime. You and Rocky deserved this win. That evening, Elena pulled into her driveway, the familiar sight of her home bringing a wave of comfort. Rocky had been at the animal hospital during the trial's conclusion, recovering from the strain of the last few weeks. Now, she was finally bringing him home for good. Inside, everything was ready. She'd spent hours preparing his space, from fluffing his favorite bed to setting out new toys and treats. A small banner hung above the doorframe, reading, Welcome home, Rocky. When Elena opened the door to the animal hospital recovery room, Rocky's ears perked up at the sound of her voice. Hey, boy, she said softly, crouching beside him, his tail thumped weakly against the bed. His bright eyes filled with recognition and excitement. Ready to go home? The vet tech smiled warmly as she helped Elena guide Rocky to his feet. He's been doing great. He'll need to take it easy for a while. But he's healing nicely. Thank you, Elena said, her gratitude evident. For everything. Rocky leaned against her as they walked to the car, his steps slower but confident. Once they reached the passenger seat, he hopped in carefully, settling onto his bed with a contented sigh. The drive home was quiet, but the air felt lighter. Elena glanced over at Rocky every few moments, her heart swelling with love and relief. He was safe. They both were. When they arrived, she opened the door, and Rocky sniffed the air, his tail wagging as he stepped onto the familiar grass. He paused, taking it all in, before trotting toward the porch. You're home, buddy, Elena said, her voice breaking slightly. We made it. Rocky barked softly, looking back at her as if to say he understood. He bounded into the house, his nose immediately exploring every corner as if reacquainting himself with his territory. When he spotted the banner, his tail wagged furiously. Elena laughed, wiping a tear from her cheek. Yeah, that's for you, she said, kneeling beside him. You're the hero of this story, Rocky. The days that followed were filled with quiet routines, moments of joy, and steady progress. Rocky's bruises faded, and his strength returned little by little. Elena found herself smiling more often, the weight of fear gradually lifting. They resumed their walks, though they stuck to different paths, once far from the park where the incident had occurred. Rocky's enthusiasm for the outdoors was undiminished, and his wagging tail never failed to lift Elena's spirits. One evening, James stopped by with a bag of groceries and a thick steak wrapped in butcher paper. I owe Rocky a dinner, he said with a grin. Elena laughed as she let him in. He's been waiting for this. Rocky greeted James with a happy bark, his tail thumping against the floor. As James prepared the steak in the kitchen, Elena watched the scene unfold with a deep sense of gratitude. James had been her anchor throughout the ordeal, and she couldn't imagine navigating it without him. When the steak was ready, Rocky devoured it with unbridled enthusiasm, his tail wagging the entire time. Elena and James shared a quiet laugh, their bond strengthened by everything they'd been through together. Months passed, and life slowly returned to normal. Jared's sentencing had brought closure, and Elena found herself focusing on the things that mattered most: her work, her home, and, above all, Rocky. One sunny afternoon, as they walked through a new park, Elena paused to watch Rocky chase a butterfly. His movements were light and free, a far cry from the injured dog who had limped beside her months ago. She smiled, her heart swelling with pride and love. "You're amazing," she said softly. "My brave boy." Rocky barked, bounding back to her side as if to remind her that they were in this together. She crouched down, wrapping her arms around him as he licked her cheek enthusiastically. "We've been through a lot," she murmured, her voice filled with emotion. "But we made it, together." As they continued their walk, the sun casting a warm glow over the path ahead, Elena felt a renewed sense of hope. The road to healing hadn't been easy, but she and Rocky had faced it head-on. And now, the future stretched out before them, bright and full of possibilities. For the first time in months, Elena felt truly at peace. With Rocky by her side, she knew they could face anything. Elena woke one crisp fall morning to the sound of Rocky's eager barking. She smiled, stretching as sunlight filtered through her bedroom curtains. Life had finally settled into a comforting rhythm, but there were still moments when memories of the past resurfaced. That morning, a letter from the district attorney's office reminded her of the upcoming parole hearing for Jared Owens. It was a procedural update. Nothing urgent, but it stirred a mix of emotions within her. "Hey, Rocky," Elena said as she leaned down to scratch behind his ears. "What do you think? Do we let the past stay in the past? Or do we show up to make sure he stays where he belongs?" Rocky tilted his head, his expressive eyes gazing up at her as if he understood. Elena chuckled softly. "Yeah, you're right. Some things are worth standing up for." A week later, Elena found herself once again walking into a courthouse. This time, it wasn't for a trial but a parole hearing. James had offered to accompany her, but she insisted on going alone. This was something she needed to do for herself and for Rocky. The hearing was brief. Jared Owens, clad in a prison jumpsuit, looked far less intimidating than he had months ago. He barely glanced in her direction as she spoke. "Your Honor," Elena began, her voice clear but firm. "This man didn't just attack me and my dog. He violated a sense of safety and trust that everyone deserves. My dog, Rocky, almost didn't survive because of his cruelty. I ask that the court deny his parole and ensure he serves the full sentence. People like Jared need to understand that their actions have lasting consequences." The board deliberated for only a few minutes before announcing their decision. Parole denied. Relief washed over Elena as she left the courthouse. This time, she walked away feeling a sense of closure she hadn't known she needed. Months turned into years, and the wounds of the past slowly faded into memories. Rocky thrived, his once injured body strong and agile again. Elena's work flourished, and she found herself taking on new challenges with a confidence she hadn't felt before. One spring afternoon, Elena stood in her backyard, watching Rocky race across the grass with a smaller dog, a recent addition to their family. Daisy, a rescued mutt with endless energy, had brought new joy to their lives. The two dogs tumbled and played, their laughter like barks filling the air. "Looks like they're getting along," James said, leaning against the fence. He visited often, their friendship solidified by the trials they'd faced together. "They're inseparable," Elena replied, smiling as Daisy leapt onto Rocky's back, her tiny frame no match for his size. Rocky rolled over, pretending to surrender, his tail wagging furiously. James chuckled. "Rocky's a softie." "He is," Elena said, her voice warm, "but he's also my hero." They watched the dogs play in comfortable silence. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting the yard in a golden glow. Elena felt a profound sense of peace as she stood there, surrounded by the life she and Rocky had built together. Years later, Elena sat on the porch steps of her home, an older Rocky resting beside her. His muzzle had turned gray, and his movements were slower, but his spirit remained as lively as ever. Daisy curled up on the other side of him, her youthful energy tempered by her companion's calm. Elena ran her fingers through Rocky's fur. her heart full of gratitude. "You've given me so much, Rocky," she said softly. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Rocky's tail wagged faintly, and he nudged her hand with his nose. The bond they shared was unbreakable, forged through moments of pain and triumph, fear and courage. As the sun set, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, Elena rested her head against Rocky's. Life wasn't always easy, but it was beautiful, and she knew they'd faced it together with all the strength and love they could